They set a chair 8 feet behind him. Not for show. For landing. A heavyweight volunteer stood in front of Bruce Lee, arms raised, braced, expecting impact. Hundreds watching. Long Beach, California. 1964. Nobody knew what an inch meant yet. Lee's fist hovered near the man's chest. No wind-up. No step. Just his knuckles, barely touching sternum. And a crowd that had seen martial arts demos before. They'd seen boards break. They'd seen kicks. This looked like nothing. He moved. The man flew backward, not stumbled, launched. His body cleared the ground, traveled the full 8 feet, and slammed into the chair hard enough that it skidded. He sat there, stunned, holding his chest. The room went quiet in a way that wasn't quite applause yet. Just confusion trying to catch up. A physicist in the audience, Dr. Howard Hall, visiting from UCLA, leaned forward. He'd seen force. He understood momentum, transfer, vector dynamics. What he didn't understand was how a human body generated that much explosive energy from a distance shorter than a handshake. Lee stepped back. Calm, no explanation offered. The 1-inch punch wasn't a trick. It was a problem no one in that room could solve yet. Lee had been teaching in Oakland and then Los Angeles for 2 years. Not in schools, in garages, backyards, small groups who heard from someone who trained with someone. He moved faster than styles people recognized, and that created a problem for traditional instructors who didn't like questions. Their forms couldn't answer. By 1964, he had maybe 30 serious students. Some came from other disciplines. Some came from other disciplines. Some came because they'd seen him spar and couldn't explain what happened. He didn't advertise. He didn't need to. Ed Parker ran the Long Beach Internationals. A tournament, but also a showcase. Styles from across the Pacific, mixing with American boxing and judo. Parker had heard about Lee through mutual contacts. Someone mentioned a Chinese instructor doing things with Wing Chun that didn't look like Wing Chun anymore. Parker called him, asked if he'd demonstrate. Lee agreed, but he didn't plan a routine. He didn't choreograph. He asked what would make people pay attention. Parker suggested breaking something. Lee said no. Breaking proved material weakness, not technique. He wanted to show force transfer. Efficiency. The kind of power that didn't need distance to build. He'd been working on it for years. The 1-inch punch existed in Wing Chun as a training drill meant to teach structure, not performance. But Lee had refined it, stripped it. He believed you could generate full-body power from a static position if everything fired in sequence. No telegraphing. No room for the opponent to read or adjust. The people watching at Long Beach didn't know his credentials yet. They didn't know he'd trained under Yip Man in Hong Kong, or that he'd won a full contact match in his teens that went 60 seconds. They just saw a lean man, 23 years old, standing on a gym floor in a black uniform, asking for a volunteer. Someone in the crowd noticed he wasn't wearing a belt. The man who stepped forward weighed around 200 pounds. Solid build. Not an actor. Lee asked his name, Bob Baker, someone said later, though no one recorded it officially. Baker looked comfortable. He'd probably taken hits before. Lee positioned him carefully, feet planted, arms raised in front of his chest, forearms crossed like a shield. He told Baker not to resist, just brace. Baker nodded. He thought he understood. Then Lee turned and walked backward. 8 feet. He stopped, looked at the floor, adjusted slightly. Someone from the event staff brought a folding chair. Metal frame. Lee pointed to the spot. The chair went down directly behind Baker. People in the front rows shifted. The distance registered. 8 feet wasn't a stumble. It wasn't a step back to absorb impact. It was flying space. A few in the crowd laughed. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes when staging looks absurd before it proves itself. Lee walked back to Baker. Close. He raised his right hand and extended it until his fist touched Baker's sternum. Then he pulled back. 1 inch, maybe less. His arm stayed bent, elbow tight. No room to accelerate. No wind-up. His other hand rested at his side. Baker set his jaw. His shoulders tensed. Lee told him to breathe. The gymnasium went quieter, not silent. Yet people were still talking, still skeptical. But something in Lee's stillness made the noise feel intrusive. He wasn't preparing like fighters prepare. No shift in stance, no visible coiling. He just stood there, fist hovering, breathing steady. Baker's eyes stayed forward. He wasn't watching Lee's hand. He was watching Lee's face. Ed Parker stood off to the side, arms crossed. He'd seen demonstrations go wrong before. Timing failures. Volunteers who didn't commit. He didn't know what Lee had planned, but he knew the room was watching now. Lee's hand didn't move yet. The weight stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough that someone in the back coughed. Long enough that Baker's breathing became audible. Then Lee's hips rotated. The sound came first. A sharp exhale. Lee's, not Baker's, and then impact. Flat. Sudden. Like a car door slamming, Baker's feet left the floor. Not lifted. Launched. His body went backward in one piece. No stumble, no attempt to catch balance. Airborne. His arm stayed crossed against his chest, where Lee's fist had been a fraction of a second earlier. His face registered shock, mid-flight eyes wide, mouth open, but his body was already past the point of adjustment. He cleared 6 feet. 7. The chair appeared in his path. He hit its seat first, and the impact folded him into it. The chair skidded backward another foot, metal legs scraping tile. The sound cut through the room sharper than the hit itself. Baker sat there, both hands moved to his chest. He pressed, feeling for something. Damage, maybe. Proof. His breathing came fast, shallow. He looked at Lee, then at his own chest again, then back at Lee. The crowd hadn't reacted yet. A delayed 2 seconds where everyone processed what their eyes reported, but their expectations rejected. Then noise. Not applause, confusion made audible. Murmurs. A few gasps. Someone said, "What the hell was that?" Lee's arm had barely extended. Even now, watching him stand in the same position, it seemed impossible that the motion people hadn't quite seen had produced the result sitting 8 feet away in a folding chair. Ed Parker moved forward, instinctively checking Baker. Baker waved him off. He stood slowly, testing his legs. No injury. No bruising that would show yet. Just a red mark on his sternum, and the look of someone recalculating what force meant. Lee stepped back. He didn't bow. Didn't smile. His breathing had already returned to normal. He waited for the noise to settle, but it didn't settle. It grew. A man in the 3rd row stood up. Someone next to him pulled him back down, talking fast. Another man near the aisle turned to his companion, gesturing at the space between Lee and the chair, measuring air with his hands, trying to solve it. Dr. Howard Hall sat 5 rows back. He taught physics at UCLA, mechanics, energy systems. He'd come to Long Beach because his son trained in karate and wanted to see the tournament. He wasn't expecting this. He leaned forward. His mind had already started running calculations. Mass times acceleration, transfer efficiency, ground reaction force. The numbers didn't cooperate. Lee's fist had traveled maybe 3 inches total. His rear foot had rotated. Yes, Hall caught that, but the power source wasn't visible. The sequence was wrong. Or too fast. Or both. Hall pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. He didn't have paper. He wrote on his palm. Force estimates. Time frame guesses. Everything depended on variables he couldn't see. Baker walked back toward Lee. Slowly. He said something. Lee nodded. Baker extended his hand. They shook. The crowd took that as permission to react fully now. Applause finally came. loud, confused, amazed. Lee didn't explain. Someone called out a question. How did you do that? But Lee just smiled. Polite. Quiet. He'd shown what he came to show. Hall kept staring at his palm. The numbers didn't resolve. Hall stayed in his seat after the demonstration ended. The tournament continued. Forms competitions, sparring matches, but he wasn't watching anymore. He kept replaying the sequence. Lee's fist, Baker's flight, the chair. His son asked him something. Hall didn't hear it. The problem wasn't that Lee generated power. Fighters generated power. The problem was the distance. Newton's second law required acceleration. Acceleration required space. Lee had used almost none. Hall taught graduate students about impulse and momentum. Force over time. When a boxer throws a punch, the arm extends across 2 feet, maybe more. That distance allows velocity to build. Velocity multiplied by mass creates momentum. Momentum transfers on impact. Lee's arm never extended. 3 inches of travel, maximum. The velocity should have been negligible, but Baker's 200 pounds of mass had moved 8 feet through the air and into a chair hard enough to slide it. Hall tried a different approach. Ground reaction force. Lee's rear foot had rotated. Maybe he'd generated power through the floor, up through his legs, into his hips, and finally into his fist. That was plausible. Athletes did it. Baseball pitchers, shot putters, but the timing didn't work. Ground force needed time to transfer up through the kinetic chain. Lee's punch had happened too fast. Hall estimated maybe 1/10 of a second from initiation to impact, possibly less. He looked at his palm again. The numbers he'd written were useless without measurements. He needed high-speed footage. Force plates. Accelerometers. None of that existed here. After the event ended, Hall found Ed Parker near the registration tables. He introduced himself. Asked if Lee was still around. Parker said Lee had left 20 minutes ago, didn't stay for the rest of the tournament, had somewhere to be. Hall asked if Parker knew how to reach him. Parker gave him a phone number. An apartment in Los Angeles. He warned Hall that Lee didn't usually talk about his methods. Private teaching. Small groups. But Parker said he'd mention Hall's name if Lee called. 3 days later, Hall's phone rang. Lee's voice was calm, direct. He asked why a physicist wanted to talk about a punch. Hall explained, not the full technical breakdown. He didn't want to sound condescending, but enough to convey genuine curiosity. He admitted the force transfer didn't match conventional mechanics. Lee was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Hall didn't expect. It's not about the arm. Hall waited. The power comes from everything at once. If one part moves before another, it's already too slow. You lose it. Hall asked what "it" meant. Lee didn't answer directly. He said most people thought power came from tension, muscles contracting hard, early, holding through impact. But tension was slow. Tension created resistance in your own body before the target ever felt it. He said the punch worked because everything stayed loose until the final instant. Then everything fired, not in sequence simultaneously. Legs, hips, spine, shoulder, fist, 1 unit. Hall wrote this down. It sounded like coordination. Elite-level motor control. But that still didn't explain the energy output. He asked if Lee had ever measured it. Lee said no. He didn't need to. He could feel when it worked. When it didn't, the opponent stayed standing. Hall thanked him. He said he'd like to study it properly someday. Controlled environment. Instruments. Lee said maybe, then he hung up. Hall never got that chance. Years later, after Lee died, biomechanics researchers did study the 1-inch punch. They used force plates and high-speed cameras. They confirmed the output enough energy to move a grown man 8 feet, equivalent to a car crash at low speed, all from 3 inches. But they couldn't teach it. The principle was clear. whole-body coordination, minimal telegraphing, explosive relaxation. The execution stayed rare. Hall kept his notes. He still didn't fully understand it. Lee never demonstrated the one-inch punch publicly again after Long Beach. He used it in private sessions. Teaching moments. Someone would ask about power generation, and he'd show them, usually against a heavy bag, not a person. The bag would fly backward off its chain if he hit it right. His students tried to replicate it. Most couldn't. They had the mechanics, the stance, the fist position, the hip rotation, but something in the sequence refused to cooperate. They'd hit, and the bag would swing. Normal, predictable, not explosive. Lee would watch, then adjust their structure. Lower the shoulder. Relax the jaw. Breathe differently. Small corrections that seemed unrelated to punching. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. One student asked him directly, "What was the secret?" Lee said there wasn't one. Then he paused. He said it required emotional content. The phrase sounded strange. Mystical. People expected technical language angles, force vectors, muscle activation patterns. Instead, Lee talked about intent, feeling, the difference between trying to hit something and committing to move through it. He demonstrated on a student named Dan Inosanto. Had him hold a pad against his chest. Lee placed his fist 1 inch away. He told Inosanto to stay loose, don't resist. Then he asked him a question. "Are you ready?" Inosanto nodded. Lee didn't move yet. He asked again, "Are you ready?" Inosanto said yes, firmer this time. Lee hit him. Inosanto slid backward 3 feet, pad still pressed to his chest. He said it felt like being shoved by something larger than Lee's fist. Not a punch, a wave. Lee explained it differently each time someone asked. Once he said it was about eliminating unnecessary motion. Another time he said it required thinking past the target. He referenced Wing Chun's centerline theory, attacking the opponent's structure, not their surface. He mentioned Qi, then immediately dismissed it when Western students looked confused. He said Qi was just efficient biomechanics that Chinese culture had named differently. But he also said some people would never get it, not because they lacked skill, because they couldn't let go. They held tension in places they didn't know existed. Neck, jaw, lower back. That tension acted like a brake. It absorbed the power before it ever left the body. In 1967, a martial arts magazine asked Lee to explain the 1-inch punch in writing. He wrote 3 paragraphs. They were vague, circular. He talked about being like water, formless, adaptive. The editor asked for something more concrete. Lee said that was the answer. The footage from Long Beach circulated slowly, grainy, black and white, 16mm film that someone had shot from the side angle. It showed Baker flying backward. It showed the chair. It didn't show Lee's body mechanics clearly enough to teach from. People who saw the footage argued about it. Some said it was staged. Baker had jumped backward. The chair was placed for theatrics. Others said they'd felt Lee's power firsthand and knew it wasn't fake. The arguments went nowhere. Lee stopped talking about it publicly. He moved on. Developed Jeet Kune Do, fought different battles, philosophical ones, about style versus no style, tradition versus adaptation. The 1-inch punch became a footnote, a party trick people mentioned when his name came up, but the people who'd been in that gymnasium in 1964 didn't forget. Bob Baker told the story for years. Always the same details. The chair. The 8 feet. The way his chest hurt for 2 days after, not from bruising, but from something deeper. Structural. Like his rib cage had compressed and expanded too fast. Dr. Hall wrote a paper in 1971, unpublished. He sent it to a few colleagues in biomechanics. It outlined the theoretical framework for generating maximum force from minimum distance. He cited Lee once, briefly. No one followed up on it. Lee died in 1973. The 1-inch punch became legend after that. Easier to mythologize than explain. People stopped asking how. They just repeated that it happened. Researchers tried to reverse engineer it in the decades after. Universities, sports science labs, they brought in martial artists, kung fu practitioners, boxers, karate experts, and had them attempt 1-inch punches against force plates. The plates measured impact, pounds per square inch, newtons, energy transfer. Most subjects generated respectable force, enough to hurt someone, not enough to launch them. A few came close, high-level practitioners who'd trained specifically in short-range power. Their numbers approached what Lee had done, but approached wasn't replication. The consistency wasn't there. One attempt would spike, the next would drop by 40%. High-speed cameras revealed something. The subjects who generated the most force had a micro-delay in their movement, a fraction of a second where nothing visible happened, then sudden full-body activation. Frame-by-frame analysis showed the pelvis rotating first, but only by milliseconds. Then the shoulder, then the fist, but the timing was so compressed it looked simultaneous to the naked eye. One researcher called it ballistic summation. Every joint contributing maximum force at the exact instant of impact. Not before, not after. The window was impossibly narrow. Miss it by 1/100th of a second, and the power dissipated into your own structure instead of the target. They published papers, diagrams, training protocols. Some fighters improved their short-range striking after reading them. None reproduced the 8-foot launch. The footage from Long Beach stayed relevant. Martial arts documentaries used it. YouTube videos analyzed it. People slowed it down, frame by frame, looking for the secret, commenters argued. Some still claimed it was fake. Others posted their own attempts hitting bags, pushing training partners. The bags swung. The partners stepped back. Nothing flew. In 2009, a biomechanics team at a university in England built a robotic arm designed to replicate Lee's punch. They programmed it with every measurable variable from the footage, angle, rotation speed, strike duration. The arm generated impressive force. It didn't match Lee's output. The researchers concluded that human neuromuscular coordination allowed for force amplification. Their motors couldn't simulate. Biological systems had response times. Their robotics couldn't compress further. The 1-inch punch stayed unsolved because the problem wasn't mechanical. The mechanics were documented, measurable, teachable even. But the execution required something harder to transfer. Timing that lived in the nervous system. Relaxation that fought against every instinct to tense before impact. Commitment that didn't flinch or hedge at the final millisecond. Lee had called it emotional content. Maybe that was accurate. Maybe it wasn't emotion. Maybe it was just the difference between knowing what to do and doing it without interference. Bob Baker lived into his 70s. In interviews late in life, people still asked him about the punch. He said he'd never felt anything like it before or after. He said it wasn't painful exactly, just overwhelming, like being hit by something that shouldn't have had room to build speed. Dr. Arger Hall retired from UCLA in 1989. His notes on the punch stayed in a file cabinet in his home office. He never published them. When asked why, he said the math was incomplete. There were variables he couldn't measure. He suspected Lee had found an efficiency ceiling that theory predicted, but practice rarely reached. The chair from Long Beach disappeared years ago. No one kept it. No one thought to. It was just a folding chair. Some people still train the 1-inch punch. Fewer teach it. The ones who do warn students that it takes years, that most will never generate full power. That it's not about strength or speed in the usual sense. The demonstration lasted maybe 10 seconds. Baker flying. The chair scraping. Silence turning into noise. Decades later, people still can't explain what they saw. Some left inspired, others unsettled. That stayed with people.